Well, good morning and thanks for joining us. We go live now to the U.S. Senate, where lawmakers will open the day with an hour of speeches before they get back to work on an energy efficiency bill. That legislation is aimed at helping manufacturers to develop energy-efficient technologies for their businesses. Negotiations continue on a number of amendments to be offered, including one by Louisiana Senator David Vitter relating to health care. And live now to the floor of the U.S. Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Gracious Savior, lead our lives so we will bring you pleasure, receiving the smile of heaven's approval. Guide our senators, inspiring them to do justly, to love mercy, and to embrace humility as they walk with you. Lord, strengthen them, making them eager to lift burdens and to respond to human needs. In your unfailing love, give them the wisdom to follow the leading of your powerful providence. Do for them immeasurably, abundantly, above all that they can ask or imagine. We pray in your merciful name. Amen.
Now please join with me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., September 18, 2013. To the Senate. Under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Edward J. Markey, a senator from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, to perform the duties of the Chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President pro tempore.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
Following leader remarks, we'll be in a period of morning business. Republicans will control the first 30 minutes, majority the second 30 minutes. Following that morning business, the Senate will resume consideration of the Energy Savings and Industrial Competitiveness Act. Mr. President, we've tried really hard to work on this energy bill, but it's no wonder that the news is reporting today this is the least productive Senate in the history of the country. We have a number of Republican senators and lots of them in the House members, Republican House members, who don't believe in government. They want to get rid of it. And they're doing everything they can to make that a fact. We're waiting now to see what's going to come from the House with the way to fund government or not fund it. As you know, Mr. President, they're obsessed with the constitutional law that's been in effect now for 4 years, declared constitutional by the United States Supreme Court. The latest we got from our floor staff is that the Republicans on this energy bill want 5 non-germane amendments and whatever other amendments are filed dealing with energy, which is meaning we're not going to finish the legislation. That's an understatement. But we'll proceed. We have a number of issues that we're going to work on. We have one that We filed what was called a Rule 14 procedure yesterday, dealing with continuing to allow our high-tech industry to be competitive. And so we will move forward doing the best we can and wait and see what the House is going to do. They're still struggling to find out which absurd idea is going to prevail over there. Mr. President, I'm told there are bills at the desk due for second readings.
The clerk will read the titles of the bills for a second time.
S. 1513, a bill to amend the Helium Act and so forth and for other purposes. S. 1514, a bill to save coal jobs and for other purposes. H.R. 2009, an act to prohibit the Secretary of the Treasury from enforcing the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act and the Health Care and Education Reconciliation Act of 2010. H.R. 2775, an act to condition the provision of premium and cost-sharing subsidies under the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act and so forth and for other purposes.
Mr. President, I would object to any further proceedings with respect to all of these bills that were just read into the record.
Objection is heard. Placed on the calendar under Rule 14.
Mr. President, each year, Hispanic Heritage Month offers an opportunity to honor the contributions of a community that has contributed to our country's progress for centuries. In the state of Nevada, the influence of Hispanic Americans is evident even in the name of the state, which means snow-capped. And, of course, our most famous city, one of the most famous cities in the world, Las Vegas, means the Meadows. It was a place in pioneer days that had was an oasis in the desert, and that's an understatement. Water, these artesian wells that bubbled out of the ground. That was the beginning of Las Vegas, the Meadows. Mr. President, the first non-Native American to set eyes on Las Vegas was a man by the name of Rafael Rivera. We honor him in Nevada. There are facilities named after him, and in my office here, in my conference room, I have a wonderful painting of Rafael Rivera looking down into Las Vegas. He looked so good, all dressed in this finery, but in reality, he was lost. And he had been with a Spanish expedition and was lost. But he's the first to see Las Vegas. And we recognize that, and the picture is terrific. You see him looking down into a place where there's nothing other than the Meadows. But now there's 2.5 million people there. Nevada and across the nation, we see the contributions of Hispanic Americans in every facet of our society. On the battlefield, the boardroom, courtroom, classroom, art galleries, and on the playing fields. Hispanic Americans have also played an important role in this nation's armed forces, serving in every conflict since the Revolutionary War. And more than 2.3 million Hispanic-owned businesses employ millions of Americans, provide critical goods and services, and help drive our economy. Nationwide, Latinos are expected to make up about 60% of the population in the decades to come. To ensure our country thrives, we must ensure its Hispanic population thrives as well. Hispanic Heritage Month should be one to celebrate, but also one to reflect on what we can do to help Hispanic families thrive. And this year affords a special moment for reflection as the nation commemorates 50 years since the historic March on Washington for jobs and freedom. The struggle for equality, justice, and freedom is ongoing. But through civic engagement, Hispanic Americans and all Americans can make heard in Washington their support for quality education, quality health care, a living wage, and the right to vote without intimidation or discrimination. Congress heard their calls for quality, affordable health insurance. That's why we passed, among other reasons, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. It was a huge step forward for Hispanic families in Nevada and across the country. In Nevada alone, 160,000 Latinos and more than 10 million nationwide who currently lack health insurance will be eligible for coverage through the new marketplaces, which are going to start on October 1st. Congress heard the calls for opportunity during tough economic times. Democrats made small business loans possible for 11,000 Hispanic-owned businesses. We've significantly cut predatory and discriminatory lending practices that disproportionately affected Hispanic communities. And last year, Congress cut taxes for 98% of American families, including every middle-class family. Congress also heard the calls for fair, practical immigration reform. And this year, the United States Senate passed a bipartisan immigration bill that will reform America's legal immigration system and reduce the deficit by $1 trillion. This measure will also help 11 million people tired of looking over their shoulders and fearing deportation to get right with the law and start down an earned pathway to citizenship. The Senate, though, Mr. President, is still waiting, as we have for lots of things, for the Republicans in the House to allow a vote on the Senate's bipartisan compromise. What better way to celebrate this month's importance than to pass a bill that would allow millions of families to stay together and reach their full potential? So, Mr. President, I look forward to Hispanic Heritage Month again as an opportunity to reaffirm my commitment to support the 52 million Latinos in America through our work here in the Senate. To me, Hispanic Heritage Month is about recognizing the incredible contributions of Hispanic Americans to our nation, but it's also about building a brighter future for Hispanic Americans in our nation.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
Earlier this week, we passed the 5-year mark since the financial crisis hit our country. Incredibly, President Obama tried to use that opportunity to take credit for the fact that things aren't as bad as they were back then. And he's back at it again today. Basically, his message is this: America isn't in a free fall, so everyone should give him a big pat on the back. Well, as far as deflections go, it's pretty creative, but it's also pretty misleading, because in an effort to justify his own failed policies and preserve them, the President is papering over some pretty troubling realities. The truth is, for most Americans, the past few years have felt like anything but a recovery. It's been a story of lost jobs and underemployment and the loss of dignity that comes with both. It's been a period of stagnant wages and an increasing disparity between rich and poor. And then there are all the young people who've been stunned to realize, after graduating from college, there just aren't any jobs out there. So now is not the time for victory laps. Because if this is his idea of success, I'd hate to see what failure looks like. Today, nearly 8 million Americans who want full-time jobs can only find part-time work. That's nearly twice as many involuntary part-timers as we had throughout most of the previous administration. And of course, Obamacare will make this much worse. What's more, the poor and middle-income folks and those just starting out on their own are some of the people who've been struggling the most in the Obama economy. The unemployment rate for low-income Americans, for instance, now stands at 21%. 21% unemployment for low-income Americans, right about where it was during the Great Depression. The President likes to claim credit for jobs that have been created since the so-called recovery began. But what he fails to mention is that there are still fewer jobs today than before the crisis hit, while real median wages haven't gone up at all over the past 5 years. And even though candidate Obama promised to, quote, spread the wealth around, end quote, we found that 95% of recent income gains have actually gone to the richest among us. 95% of recent income gains have gone to the richest among us. In other words, We're again faced with the tragic irony that those on the left who claim most loudly to be standing up for fairness and equality often end up getting the worst results for those who need help the most. To paraphrase President Reagan's old line about the apostles of quote-unquote fairness, maybe they are fair in one way. Their policies don't discriminate. They bring misery to everybody. Unless, of course, you're among the elite of the elite. And we all know why that is. Because when government policies hurt economic growth by stifling opportunities and drying up investment, it's the American worker who loses. It's those at the bottom of the economic ladder who suffer the most. So the best thing we can do to help the poor and working classes is to get the private sector growing again. And we know how it's done, by implementing things like a more competitive tax code, regulatory relief, approval of the Keystone Pipeline, and, of course, repealing Obamacare, which is killing jobs. The fact is, the policies of today's Washington Democrats actually entrench unfairness and make the playing field even more uneven. Even the President's allies are beginning to understand. Big Labor wants to rewrite some provisions of the same Obamacare law they helped muscle through. Why? Because, predictably, Obamacare is now hurting the 40-hour work week and undermining the kind of employer-sponsored plans their members like and were told they'd be able to keep. And union bosses also know that the President recently agreed to delay parts of the law for businesses. Now they want relief, too. Why for businesses and not for unions? But what about everybody else? What about the middle class? What about college graduates? Or young couples trying to make ends meet while they start a family? Don't those folks deserve some relief from Obamacare, too? That's why Senator Coates and I filed an amendment last week that would allow everyone else to take advantage of the Obamacare delay already offered to businesses. If companies get to catch a break, then Republicans think the middle class should, too. And the Democrats who run Washington need to stop blocking us from even taking a vote on this important legislation. Legislation that already passed the House of Representatives, by the way, on a bipartisan basis. After all, as I've already indicated, Obamacare is a big reason we're turning into a nation of part-time workers, and that so many Americans will lose their jobs and the health care plans they like. It's also one of the reasons that the rate of those either working or looking for work has dropped back to Carter-era levels. Carter-era levels. And that the average time it takes to find a job is longer than it's been literally in decades. These are all good reasons not just to delay, but to repeal this law and start over with bipartisan reforms that can actually reduce costs instead of killing jobs. And I have confidence we'll get there eventually, because the only person who seems to be happy with Obamacare is the guy it's named after. The guy it's named after. Because when everyone from union bosses to working moms want to repeal this thing, it's hard to escape the conclusion that the people standing in the way are more interested in what's good for their legacies than what's good for the country. But look, I'm still holding out hope. I really hope the President will take his 5-year anniversary of the financial crisis as a chance to reflect and to change course. I hope he'll finally admit that what he's tried thus far just hasn't worked, that it's not enough to just improve the lot of those who have influence in government, that you have to work for the middle class, too. I hope he starts working with members of both parties to start over on health care, to put our economy on a sound and sustainable footing, to get spending under control so we don't leave the same kind of mess to our children, as CBO warned us again yesterday. Most importantly, I'm hoping he starts thinking of ways to give those who are struggling in this economy a real chance to succeed. And when he does, Republicans will be here ready to work with him, just as we have since he first came to office. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business for 1 hour, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled by the two leaders or their designees, with the Republicans controlling the first half and the majority controlling the final half.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, as you know, today marks the 5th anniversary of the 2008 financial panic, which threw our country into a severe recession, and the worst economic crisis this country has had since the 1930s. So it's been 5 years since Lehman Brothers collapsed. It's been 5 years since the federal government seized full control of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. It's been 5 years since Washington bailed out AIG, the giant insurance company. In the weeks and months following the events of September 2008, members of both parties agreed that one of the most important things we could do is to fix the idea of too big to fail when it came to some of the largest financial institutions in America. Too big to fail, so the only alternative was for taxpayers to bail them out. We wanted to end it. 5 years later, I wish I could say we had succeeded. I wish I could say that too big to fail was a thing of the past. Unfortunately, the very law that was passed by our Democratic friends primarily, that was supposed to end too big to fail, actually codified it, actually made it more certain to occur, because it gave federal regulators the power to identify something called systemically important institutions. Doesn't that sound suspiciously like too big to fail if you're systemically important financial institutions? We've already seen that systemically important firms enjoy huge funding advantages over smaller competitors, primarily community bankers in places like my state, mostly because of the perception that these large companies enjoy a government bailout guarantee. In other words, their cost of doing business is lower because people actually perceive that they have a federal government backstop available to bail them out if they get into trouble. Not so. Small credit unions, community bankers in places like my state and around the country. In other words, Dodd-Frank, rather than weakening this concept, actually strengthened a de facto partnership between Washington, D.C. and New York, and primarily Wall Street. That's the exact opposite of what I think the American people thought was happening, and certainly the opposite of what they were demanding since 2008. And it is exactly the opposite of what our financial system needs in order to operate more safely and to avoid taxpayer bailouts like we saw following 2008. This is just another reason why the U.S. economy continues to slog along with the weakest recovery and the longest period of high unemployment since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Nearly 38% of America's unemployed have been jobless for more than 6 months. Let me say that again. Nearly 38% of Americans unemployed have been jobless for more than 6 months. Now those are tragic statistics, because we all know that the longer someone is unemployed, the harder it is for them to get back into a job, because they lose the skills, they become less competitive in the labor markets. The only reason that unemployment rates actually fell was not because the economy was getting strong enough to create new jobs, but it's because fewer and fewer people actually were looking for work. More and more people actually gave up. All you have to do is go on the Internet and look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics under something called the labor participation rate. And you can see that the percentage of people actually looking for work has declined to the lowest period in about 30 years or so. A recent study concludes that America is still 8.3 million jobs away from a full economic recovery. 8.3 million Americans out of work who need to be back at work in order for us to get back on track. Now, is it any wonder that the Pew Research Center, a recent poll, said that 52% of people feel like our job situation has hardly recovered at all since the Great Recession? 52% think things haven't really gotten that much better. Nevertheless, there seems to be this divide, this gulf between perception in Washington among the political elites and on Main Street. For example, in an ABC News broadcast this past weekend, President Obama said that since he took office, America has witnessed progress across the board. I guess progress is a relative term. But since the official end of the recession in June 2008, median household income has declined by nearly $2,500. Average working families have $2,500 less to spend. So, of course, they don't feel like we've had a recovery. They don't feel like things have gotten better across the board like the president. And, of course, that's before we even account for inflation. When we adjust the numbers to reflect the increase in consumer prices, the drop in median household income has been significantly larger than the $2,500 I just mentioned. Now, the president says he's concerned about income inequality, about the difference between the wealthy and average working families and the poor. But the New York Times has reported that the trend of rising income inequality appears to have accelerated during this president's administration. It's gotten worse. Indeed, according to one measure of the income gap, inequality has increased about 4 times faster under President Obama than it did under President George W. Bush. Of course, America's income gap is mirrored by a yawning unemployment gap. Earlier this week, the Associated Press reported that the gap in employment rates between America's highest and lowest income families had stretched to its widest levels since officials began tracking the data a decade ago. Again, this is happening under a president who said that rising income inequality is morally wrong, a president who believes that rising income inequality is holding America's economic recovery back. But the problem is not in his diagnosis, it's in his proposed remedies, his policies. His proposed remedies for growing inequality include more taxes, more spending by the federal government, more debt, and more regulations. It really is symptomatic of this idea that Washington knows best. Well, it doesn't. And we know because of the failed experiments of the last 5 years. Of course, if such policies were really part of the solution, inequality would be declining. In other words, if the president's proposed solutions of more regulations, more taxes, and more federal spending would work, well, we'd be well on our way to an economic recovery. Unemployment would be back to historic norms, and the economy would be growing. But it's not. Well, then there's the cost of health insurance. This is another one of the burdens on particularly small businesses and individuals which are keeping the economy stagnant. Back in 2008, the president famously promised that premiums for a family of 4 would decrease by about $2,500 if we would just pass his signature health care legislation, now known as Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. But instead, the cost has gone up by nearly $2,400 between 2009 and 2012. So here we have median household income going down about $2,500, but actually the cost of health care, rather than going down, it's going up by about the same amount. For that matter, the cost problem will only get worse once Obamacare is fully implemented, as we're beginning to see, as we see what the premiums are like in the individual market for people who buy their health care in the exchanges. National Journal found that for the vast majority of Americans, premiums will be higher under Obamacare. And that's pretty easy to understand because of the way that it's been wired. For example, someone has said it's like because of the guaranteed issue aspect of Obamacare, you can wait until you're sick to buy health insurance, and the insurance company has to sell it to you. So someone has said that's like waiting till your house is on fire before you actually buy fire insurance. Well, that's not insurance anymore. And that runs up the cost for everybody, as does a phenomenon like age banding, where young people my daughter's age, in their early 30s, are going to have to bear the cost of health care for older Americans because you can't charge older Americans any more than 3 times more what you charge young, healthy people like my daughters. And that even though their cost of health care, their consumption of health care, we know won't be anywhere near that ratio. Well, it's projected that the President's health care law will cause individual insurance premiums to skyrocket all across America, including Texas. Policies like Obamacare and Dodd-Frank, as I keep hearing from my community bankers, have increased the cost of doing business and generated enormous uncertainty about the future. I was talking to a businessman in Houston just 2 days ago. He said the thing that's holding America back, our economy back, is uncertainty. People just don't know what their taxes are going to be like, what the regulatory environment is going to be like. They don't know about our failure to deal with our national debt, now about $17 trillion, as the Fed begins to wind down its purchases of our own debt. Interest rates start to go back up. What is that going to mean? Well, it's going to mean we have to pay China and other creditors more money for the money they've loaned to us because of that $17 trillion debt, and it will simply crowd out our ability to fund other priorities like national security, among others. Well, the story of our sluggish recovery is ultimately the story of wasted human capital. Again, another tragedy. It's a story of mothers and fathers who can't find full-time jobs and who are having trouble supporting their families. It's a story of college graduates who are unemployed, living at home, and drowning in student loan debt. As economists Keith Hennessy and Ed Lazier have written, the severe recession was bad enough, but the slow recovery is doing just as much damage to living standards since it is sustained over a longer time frame. So I would say to our President, if you really care about reducing income inequality, if you really care about saving the American dream, let's try something new. You know, the definition of insanity, one pundit said, was doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. So let's try something new, because we know the status quo has not worked. So instead of piling more burdens on job creators and making it harder for Americans to secure full-time employment, let's embrace policies that make it easier to create jobs and easier to get full-time work. Let's reform our tax code so it's pro-growth, make it simpler, make it fairer, make it more logical, make it more conducive to that strong economic growth that's going to create jobs. And let's go back to the drawing board on health care and embrace a sensible, patient-centered reforms that will reduce costs and increase accessibility. We're never going to change our economic trajectory until we change our economic policies. Again, doing the same thing over and over again isn't going to change the outcome. We need to try something new. The policies of the past 4.5 years have given us an economy that's failing to deliver the kind of job creation and income gains that Americans want and they need. As the President's own Treasury Secretary said just this week, too many Americans cannot find work. Growth is not fast enough, and the very definition of what it means to be middle class is being undercut by trends in our economy that must be addressed. I couldn't agree with him more. So isn't it time to try something different? Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President. The Senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, today I'd like to
follow up on some of the comments by Senator Cornyn about these massive burdens on American families, how it's impacting their lives, their quality of life, and these are burdens forced upon them by this administration. So today I rise to talk about an amendment that I filed to the energy efficiency bill that we're debating today on the floor. This amendment would stop President Obama's attempt to impose a massive increase to the national energy bill. It will affect all Americans because, in a sense, essentially what we have is a huge energy tax caused by government regulations. My amendment blocks the issuance of new carbon pollution standards for new and existing coal-fired power plants. Those standards are due out from the Environmental Protection Agency this very week, and they can do great harm to the American economy and to American families. We need to make America's energy as clean as we can, as fast as we can. Everyone knows that. It's important, though, that we do it without hurting our economy and without costing thousands of middle-class jobs. The American people, through their elected representatives in Congress, have rejected President Obama's reckless energy policies in the past. So this past June, President Obama issued a presidential memorandum directing the EPA to issue carbon pollution standard regulations. My amendment would require the approval of Congress for any regulations causing increases of our national energy bill, just like the one the EPA would create with these regulations. If these regulations are allowed to take effect, they will increase energy costs for the people who can bear the burden the least: seniors, low-income families, small businesses. High energy costs will destroy thousands of jobs in places like my home state of Wyoming, but also in Missouri and Ohio, West Virginia, Montana, and many other states. We've already seen coal-fired power plants shut down and reduce capacity, putting many people out of work. That's been the President's plan all along, and these new regulations would just be the latest step. Remember, President Obama said that under his plan, he said, quote, electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket. Skyrocket. That's his word, not mine. He said that energy producers could still build coal-fired power plants, but that the cost would be so high, he said it would bankrupt them. The President should be looking for ways to help businesses grow, to help create jobs, not pushing his regulations to find backdoor ways to bankrupt them. My amendment accomplishes a number of goals, beginning with protecting American jobs. That's been our focus in this difficult economy. The nation's recession ended more than 4 years ago. We've not had the recovery, though, that we should have had because the President's policies have failed. The President promised he had a plan to create so-called green jobs. People have seen that those green jobs never materialized, and now the President is going after the red, white, and blue jobs that continue to power our country. The Obama administration and its allies in the fringe environmental movement say that we need to get rid of these jobs to make way for new ones. They say that coal miners and power plant workers should fade into history, along with the men and women who built stagecoaches and telegraphs and record players. Their idea is that if we simply let coal die, those folks can start making something new. Well, that kind of thinking is a luxury that a lot of Americans don't want and can't afford. When excessive Washington red tape crushes a coal mine or a coal-fired power plant in a small community, those jobs aren't the only ones that go. The town loses its revenue base. That hurts its public schools, its police, its fire departments, senior busing services for those who can't drive. Everything that that town does to serve its people, all of that suffers because of decisions made by this administration in Washington, D.C. Before long, people start to move away, looking for a better chance somewhere else. Small businesses don't have enough customers, so they shut down. The town withers away. When Washington uses the heavy hand of excessive regulation, there's a whole host of ways it hurts American communities. One of those ways is its impact on public health. Studies consistently show that unemployment increases the likelihood of illness, hospital visits, and premature death. Families where a parent is out of work are more likely to fall into poverty. Children in poor families are 4 times as likely as other children to be in fair or poor health. The bureaucrats at the EPA can shake their magic 8-ball to predict health impacts of carbon pollution on virtual people who haven't been born yet years into the future. But if their predictions are wrong, and I expect that they are, well, they'll just simply shake their magic 8-ball again. Meanwhile, the health effects caused by their excessive regulations are very, very real for real families, real children, real seniors. So my amendment addresses this public health issue. It does it by preventing this massive unemployment that would result from new red tape and higher energy costs. Finally, my amendment is clear that Congress should act on an affordable energy plan. And nothing in my amendment says that Congress shouldn't work with state and local governments to protect communities from severe weather events where lives are at stake. My amendment is clear that these kinds of decisions should be for Congress to make, not for the President to make on his own. That's true whether the President is a Democrat or a Republican. So I hope to get a vote on my amendment to ensure that the Obama administration does not impose an increase in our national energy bill on the American people. And, Mr. President, along the same lines, I want to speak briefly about another opportunity we have to ensure a stronger energy future for our country. This week will mark an anniversary that I hope will spur the American people to demand some action from the Obama administration. 5 years ago, 5 full years ago, TransCanada first applied for permission to build the Keystone XL pipeline. 5 years, and President Obama still can't make up his mind to approve the permit. He dithers, he delays, he makes excuses. It is time to act. It's time finally to approve the Keystone XL pipeline so that America can start to get the benefits of this important energy project. Now, according to the State Department analysis, the pipeline's construction could support 42,000 jobs across the country. The President should be grabbing any opportunity he can to help the private sector create jobs. Instead, he said that the jobs that the Keystone XL pipeline would create, he said, are, quote, just a blip relative to the need. Is this how the President sees the livelihoods of 42,000 American families? Just a blip? This is the 4th major pipeline project between Canada and the United States since 2006. All the others were approved, and the process took between 15 months and 28 months for each of them. The permit process for Keystone XL is now 60 months and still counting. Why is it taking so long? In October 2010, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said her department was inclined to approve the project. In July 2011, the administration said it was publicly committed to reaching a decision, they said, before the end of the year. That was 2011. The deadline came and it went. This past June, the President suddenly raised the bar. He said that the net effects of the pipeline's impact on our climate will be absolutely critical, he said, to his decision. Well, we know today what those effects would be. Studies show that the Keystone XL pipeline would not be a substantial impact on greenhouse gas emissions, and that's because even if the pipeline doesn't get built, the energy is still going to be developed. China has absolutely offered to buy the energy from Canada. This pipeline has the support of more than 70% of the American people. It has the support of major labor unions and of every state along its route. A bipartisan majority in the House and 62 senators support it. Still, President Obama can't make up his mind. He delays his decision on this vital infrastructure project, and at the same time, he's trying to impose what amounts to a national energy tax. He refuses to allow a project that would create thousands of jobs, and at the same time orders regulators that would destroy thousands of jobs. He stalls a pipeline that would help middle-class families while he promotes a policy that would take more money out of the pockets of hardworking Americans. We need to improve America's energy picture without destroying jobs or bankrupting our country. Now, President Obama can help do that. He can do it today by doing 2 things. First, he should drop his plan to impose a new increase on national energy costs and let it be debated by Congress. And second, he should immediately approve the Keystone XL pipeline. If the President is serious about helping middle-class families, he will prove it. If he's not ready to join Democrats and Republicans in Congress in making reasonable energy policies that help American families, then the Senate should act. Struggling middle-class families are asking for our help, and it is time to give them the help that they need. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The senator from Hawaii.
I ask unanimous consent to speak for up to 15 minutes.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise to speak on the Affordable Care Act. At home in Hawaii, we have a saying, "Lucky you live Hawaii." That can mean a lot of different things to different people, but when talking about access to affordable, effective health care, this phrase has particular meaning. In the early 1970s, the rate of uninsured in our state was about 30%, meaning that roughly 1 in 3 in our population would live in fear that a sickness or injury could cause financial ruin for themselves or their families. The people of Hawaii knew this was unacceptable, and in 1974, the state government passed an innovative piece of legislation, the Prepaid Health Care Act. Now simply known as prepaid, this legislation required employers to provide affordable and quality care for hundreds of thousands of individuals and their families. Now our uninsured rate is one of the lowest in the country, with only 8% of our population lacking any type of insurance. So even though Hawaii has been at the forefront in making health care a right and not a privilege, we still have a ways to go. Even with prepaid, there are more than 100,000 people in our state still uninsured. When the Affordable Care Act passed 3 years ago, I knew it meant that those who are uninsured or underinsured in Hawaii would find some relief. We've already seen major successes since this landmark legislation has passed. Yet people are still afraid of Obamacare. And that's because a lot of people have spent a lot of time and money to make the American public believe that somehow this legislation is bad for them, will harm them. That's why when asked about health care reform as a whole, many Americans say they are concerned, they have anxiety. But when you talk to people back in Hawaii and across the nation, and even those who think they don't like health care reform, they like what it does. For example, parents like that they can keep their children on their health insurance until the age of 26, which affects 6,000 young adults in the state of Hawaii. People will no longer have to live in fear of lifetime limits on health benefits, which will help 460,000 residents of Hawaii, including 115,000 children. More than 500,000 people in my state will no longer have to worry about being denied coverage because of a pre-existing condition. And as a state that has committed to the Medicaid expansion, Hawaii will also now be able to provide care to close to 68,000 more residents, starting in 2014. People like these policies. People like what health care reform is already doing for them. And while my colleagues across the aisle are looking to repeal this historic legislation, I'm looking forward to how we can build on its success. Let me be clear, the fact that health care reform is working and is exactly why the detractors of the ACA are trying so hard to stop it from being fully implemented. They know that the American people are embracing Obamacare because of all the good it will do for our families. In particular, I'm looking forward to the opening of our marketplace, the Hawaii Health Connector, on October 1st. Many people I've spoken to want to know what the marketplace may mean for them. Simply, the Hawaii Health Connector is going to provide a consumer-friendly way for residents of my state to view and compare a wide variety of plans. Then they'll be able to pick the coverage that best suits them and their families. My office has been in constant contact with the Connector, and their staff in Hawaii has been working tirelessly to set up the online and phone interface and to provide assistance and navigation in the form of kokua, a word in Hawaiian that essentially means pitching in to help your neighbors and your community with no regard for personal gain. That's reflective of the values we have in Hawaii, that everyone deserves to be healthy and have access to affordable and quality care. Now, that doesn't mean we don't still have a lot of work to do. I'm hoping that a number of bills that I've introduced, including the Rural Preventative Health Care Training Act and the Strengthening Health Disparities Data Collection Act, will be considered and voted on by the full Senate in order to solve some of our worst issues in providing care to rural and underserved populations in Hawaii and across the nation. But I believe ACA is working the way it should be. It is increasing the number of insured Americans, promoting preventative care that will help to reduce the human and financial cost of avoidable illness, and lowering the cost of care for everyone. Many of my colleagues here in the U.S. Congress choose not to see any of this. The only option for them is total repeal, with zero tolerance for open discussion or compromise on this landmark legislation. But that kind of thinking is what causes the gridlock that Americans are so tired of. I understand that there will be parts of this law, which is a sweeping piece of legislation, that will need to be amended over time to resolve any kinks. These kinds of revisions have been done with every other landmark domestic social policy that has been passed in this country, including Medicare and Social Security. I'm willing, as are my colleagues on the Democratic side, to come to the table and work with Republicans to make necessary improvements over time. But I refuse to engage in the process of political and parliamentary gymnastics designed to score small, short-term wins at the expense of the American people and the economy. It's got to be pointed out that anyone who wants to grind the entire government to a halt over the implementation of this several years old law will cause harm to the economy, cause harm to their communities, because federal funding provides essential services and programs to constituents in every state, in every county, and every district. If improvements or changes need to be made, they can be done through the regular order, with hearings, serious discussions, and bipartisan support. Ultimately, what we are seeing in Hawaii and across the nation is that President Obama's historic health care package is making inroads in improving our health care system. And efforts to stop that cannot be tolerated by members of Congress and the people of this nation. I'll continue to support its full implementation and look forward to working with all of my colleagues in the Senate to build upon its success. Mr. President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. The Senate's currently in a quorum call, and so while we wait for members to come to the floor to speak, the chamber continues work on an energy efficiency bill. That legislation's aimed at helping manufacturers develop energy-efficient technologies for their businesses. Negotiations continue on the number of amendments to be offered, with votes possible later today. So while we wait for senators to return to the floor, we're going to take you to a live briefing with House Republican leaders on the debt ceiling and the federal spending.
Filing. Now, what's particularly interesting about this administration ignoring this infrastructure and jobs and economic driver bill and project is that shortly into his first year, the President did sign, and the State Department did recommend, a cross-border permit of a pipeline carrying oil sands into the United States. So the President didn't have a problem with the Alberta Clipper pipeline delivering oil into the United States and crossing the border until it became an environmental issue on the Keystone Pipeline. And only then, and because of politics, has the President refused to act on the permit. So I'm proud that our leadership is now discussing and contemplating putting Keystone Pipeline in whatever opportunities we may have with debt ceiling and continuing resolutions. I appreciate our leadership continued focus on this type of a job bill.
Question.
Speaker, no secret that you did not want to attach Obamacare to, or defunding Obamacare to this spending bill. I know it's not been easy to be the Speaker over this caucus, but at this point, have you just kind of lost control over the caucus?
Listen, we've got a lot of divergent opinions in the caucus, and the key to any leadership job is to listen. You know, I was here during the Gingrich era. He had a little plaque that was in his office, and it was a management model. Listen, learn, help, and lead. We listened to our colleagues over the course of the last week. We have a plan that they're happy with. We're going forward.
Mr. Speaker, doesn't this, to some degree, by moving this to the Senate, I know there's some of the plan last week, but isn't that a fait accompli? I mean, there's not going to be 60 votes. Harry Reid is probably going to strip certain things out of there, including health care.
Listen, the fight over here has been won. The House has voted 40 times to defund, change Obamacare, to repeal it. It's time for the Senate to have this fight.
But don't you know what's going to happen?
I'm not going to predict what the Senate's going to do or not do.
Mr. Speaker, will you let the House work its will and vote up or down on whatever the Senate's going to pass?
I'm not going to speculate on what the Senate's going to do or not do, or what we're going to do or not do, because it's very premature.
For the last question, Mr. Speaker, do you believe that the implications and the ramifications of a possible government shutdown are the same for the Republican Party this time as they were in 1999?
Listen, there should be no conversation about shutting the government down. That's not the goal here. Our goal here is to cut spending and to protect the American people from Obamacare. It's as simple as that. There's no interest on our part in shutting the government down. Thanks.
Hey, Secretary, how are you?
Hey guys, you want a last shot? Are you